When a 12-year-old boy suffers in silence under the cruel hands of his foster parents, they believe their secrets will stay hidden behind a perfect facade. But they're wrong. A brave teacher refuses to look away, risking everything to bring the truth to light. This is a story of strength, hope, and the fight for justice for a child who refuses to be forgotten. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and if you believe every child deserves a safe and loving home. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage and resilience. Caleb Foster sat at his desk, absently doodling in the margins of his notebook, his pencil moving in slow, repetitive strokes. The classroom buzzed with quiet chatter as his classmates flipped through their textbooks, preparing for the next lesson. The sound of chalk tapping against the blackboard was oddly soothing, and for a moment, Caleb allowed himself to forget where he would go after school, to forget the gnawing anxiety that had settled deep in his chest. Then the classroom door creaked open. A hush fell over the room as the students turned toward the doorway. Standing there, her expression unreadable, was Mrs. Langley, the school principal. The sound of the chalk against the board stopped. Ms. Porter, Caleb's teacher, glanced at Mrs. Langley before shifting her gaze toward him. "Caleb," Mrs. Langley said, her voice steady but clipped, "I need to see you for a moment." The weight in his chest grew heavier. He swallowed hard, forcing his face to remain neutral as he slipped his notebook into his backpack. The silence in the classroom stretched. He could feel eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet amusement. Whispers floated through the air, a few kids smirking, already assuming he was in trouble. Caleb didn't bother to look up. He just nodded and followed Mrs. Langley out of the room, his sneakers making soft scuffing sounds against the linoleum floor. The walk down the hallway felt endless. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, the distant murmur of other classrooms barely reaching his ears. His mind raced, scrambling through every possible reason he could be in trouble. Did I forget to turn in my homework? Did someone say something about me? His stomach twisted. Mrs. Langley didn't say a word, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She was never one for unnecessary conversation. If she was calling him to the office, it meant something serious. Then they arrived. The principal's office. The door loomed ahead, its frosted glass catching the afternoon light. Caleb hesitated, his pulse quickening. He could see the shapes of people sitting inside, waiting. Mrs. Langley opened the door and stepped inside first. Caleb followed, feeling his breath catch in his throat. There, seated stiffly in the chairs across from the principal's desk, were Greg and Diane Mitchell, his foster parents. Greg's jaw was tight, his face a carefully controlled mask of concern. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching slightly. Diane sat beside him, gripping her purse with both hands, a tight, forced smile plastered onto her face. But Caleb saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly against the fabric of her dress. They never came to school. Never. That alone told him something was very, very wrong. Mrs. Langley gestured toward the empty chair beside them. "Sit down, Caleb." He obeyed slowly, his legs barely reaching the floor as he sank into the seat. The air in the office felt thick, suffocating. Mrs. Langley settled behind her desk, folding her hands neatly as she looked at him with what seemed like practiced warmth. But beneath that, there was something else, something harder to ignore. Concern, maybe even suspicion. She exhaled, then spoke. "Caleb, your teacher, Miss Porter, has raised some concerns about you." His stomach clenched. "She's noticed some bruises on you," Mrs. Langley continued, her voice careful. "She's also observed that you've been more withdrawn than usual. She's worried that you may be struggling at home." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Greg shifted slightly in his chair. Caleb didn't dare turn to look at him, but he could feel his foster father's gaze drilling into the side of his face. A warning. Diane's grip on her purse tightened. Caleb's hands balled into fists in his lap, his nails digging into his skin. He forced his breathing to remain even, though his chest felt like it was closing in. "Say nothing. Act normal." He swallowed hard and forced his voice to work. "I'm fine," he said, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Langley didn't look convinced. "Are you sure?" Caleb's throat burned. He could feel Greg's presence beside him, his body radiating quiet rage. He knew better than to challenge it. Before he could answer, Greg spoke, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Mrs. Langley, we understand your concern, but Caleb has been through a lot. Adjusting to a new home takes time. We're doing everything we can to make sure he feels safe and supported. Diane nodded quickly, her tone syrupy sweet. Oh yes, he's such a wonderful boy. He's just still learning to trust us, aren't you, sweetheart? Caleb felt sick. The word sweetheart coming from her felt like a knife in his chest. He forced himself to nod. Mrs. Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. She studied him carefully, her gaze searching. Caleb, she said gently, do you feel safe at home? Greg's jaw tightened. The room felt colder. Caleb's nails dug deeper into his palms. He could feel sweat gathering at the back of his neck. This was it. The moment he had to choose. Tell the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and survive. His voice came out small. Yes. Silence. Mrs. Langley studied him for another long moment before finally exhaling. All right, she said, though her tone was laced with something unreadable. But Caleb, I want you to know that if you ever need to talk, my door is always open. You don't have to go through anything alone, okay? He nodded again, but the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. Mrs. Langley turned to Greg and Diane, her expression unreadable. Thank you for coming in today. We just want to make sure Caleb is doing well. Of course, Diane chirped, her smile never faltering. We appreciate your concern. Greg stood first, then placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder as he did. A firm grip. A warning. Caleb tensed. We'll talk about this later, Greg muttered under his breath, his fingers digging into Caleb's shoulder like claws. A shiver ran down Caleb's spine. He knew exactly what that meant. As they left the office, the walls of the school felt smaller, the air heavier. With every step toward the car, the familiar dread settled deep in his stomach. And as the car doors locked behind him, sealing him in with them, Caleb Foster knew. Tonight there would be consequences. The car ride home was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant peace. It was heavy, suffocating, charged with something dark and unspoken. Caleb sat in the back seat, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack, his gaze fixed on the passing trees outside the window. He didn't dare look at Greg or Diane. He didn't have to. He could feel the tension radiating off them like a thick, choking fog. Greg drove with one hand gripping the wheel too tightly, his knuckles white. Diane sat stiffly beside him, her purse clutched on her lap as if it were a lifeline. The radio was off. The only sound was the occasional swish of the windshield wipers against the glass, clearing away the light drizzle that had started falling. Caleb swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Greg shut off the car but didn't get out right away. He sat there for a moment, his jaw clenched, his fingers flexing against the steering wheel. Then, without looking at Caleb, he spoke. Get inside. His voice was eerily calm. Too calm. Caleb hesitated for only a second before pushing the car door open and stepping out. His legs felt unsteady as he walked up the porch steps. The front door was already unlocked. Diane had hurried ahead, disappearing into the house. The moment Caleb stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. He barely had time to drop his backpack before Greg's voice cut through the air like a knife. You want to tell me what that was all about? Caleb turned slowly. Greg stood just a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest. Diane was in the kitchen, standing by the sink, her back turned to them. She wasn't going to interfere. She never did. Caleb forced himself to keep his voice even. I don't know what you mean. Greg scoffed, shaking his head. Don't play dumb with me, boy. You think I didn't see that principal watching us? You think I don't know what's going on? Caleb's heart pounded. Greg took a step closer. You kept your mouth shut this time, but I saw how she looked at you. She doesn't believe us. Caleb lowered his gaze, saying nothing. Let me make something very clear to you, Greg continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. You don't talk to anyone about what happens in this house. You don't tell them a damn thing. You hear me? Caleb nodded, but Greg wasn't satisfied. I said, do you hear me? Yes, Caleb whispered. Greg's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before he finally exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off his anger. Good. I don't want to hear another word about this. Without another glance at him, Greg stalked into the living room and turned on the TV. the volume blaring as if the noise could drown out what had just happened. Diane still hadn't turned around. She was washing dishes, her hands moving mechanically, her head slightly bowed. Caleb hesitated, then took a step toward her. "Diane, go to your room, Caleb." Her voice was flat, emotionless. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing else to say. So he turned and climbed the stairs to his room, shutting the door softly behind him. That night, Caleb lay awake, staring at the thin line of light under his door. The house was mostly quiet now, except for the occasional sound of Greg shifting in his recliner downstairs, or the creak of floorboards when Diane moved through the hallway. The words from earlier played over and over in his mind. "You don't talk to anyone about what happens in this house." Greg was right about one thing. Mrs. Langley didn't believe him. Neither did Ms. Porter. They suspected something, but they had no proof. And if Caleb had learned anything in the past 2 years, it was that suspicion wasn't enough. People like Greg and Diane knew how to fool everyone. To the world, they were the perfect foster parents, kind, patient, generous. They played their roles flawlessly, fooling social workers, neighbors, even the other kids at school. Only Caleb knew the truth. He turned onto his side, reaching under his mattress. His fingers closed around the worn edges of an old photograph, the only thing he had left of his real family. It was creased and faded from being hidden away for so long, but the image was still clear. His mother's warm smile, his father's strong arms holding him as a baby. A lump formed in his throat. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He shut his eyes tightly, trying to hold back the stinging in his chest. For the longest time, he had told himself that staying silent was the safest choice. But tonight, as he clutched the photograph in the darkness, he found himself wondering if that was really true. The morning sun filtered through the thin classroom curtains, casting long streaks of light across the linoleum floor. Caleb sat at his desk, his shoulders hunched, his fingers loosely gripping a pencil. He wasn't paying attention to the lesson, not really. His mind was still stuck on last night, on Greg's warning, on Diane's cold indifference, on the quiet ache in his arm where Greg's fingers had dug in too hard. Ms. Porter's voice floated around him, explaining something about fractions, but Caleb wasn't listening. He was just counting down the hours until the school day ended, until he had to go home again. "All right, class," Ms. Porter's voice cut through his fog. "You have the next 20 minutes to work on the problems on page 72. If you need help, raise your hand." Chairs scraped against the floor as students settled into their work. Caleb kept his head down, pretending to focus. He didn't want to attract attention, but Ms. Porter had been watching him all morning. She had noticed how he came in late, how his usual quietness felt heavier today. She had noticed the way he flinched when another student accidentally bumped into him. She had noticed the faint shadows under his eyes, and she wasn't about to let it go. As she walked around the classroom checking on students' work, she made her way toward Caleb. She crouched beside his desk, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Hey, Caleb," she said gently. "You okay?" Caleb tensed, his fingers tightening around his pencil. He forced himself to nod. "Yeah, I'm fine." Ms. Porter studied him, her eyes searching for something beneath his words. She had been teaching long enough to know when a kid was lying. She had seen students like him before, the ones who carried burdens too big for their small shoulders, the ones who were always fine even when they clearly weren't. She wasn't going to push him. Not yet. "If there's ever something you need to talk about," she said softly, "I'm here." Caleb swallowed hard, staring at the numbers in his workbook. He wanted to believe her, but he knew better. At home, trust was a dangerous thing. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Caleb kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, answering only when necessary. When the lunch bell rang, he moved quickly, weaving through the crowd of students to find his usual quiet corner in the cafeteria. He liked sitting alone. It was safer that way. No one asked questions. No one noticed him. Except today, someone did. A tray clattered onto the table across from him, and Caleb looked up in surprise. "You always sit alone?" The boy sitting across from him was new. Caleb had seen him around but never talked to him. He had shaggy dark hair, an easy grin, and an energy that Caleb immediately found overwhelming. Caleb hesitated before answering. I like the quiet. The boy shrugged, taking a big bite of his pizza. Cool, I'll sit here tomorrow too. Caleb blinked. You don't even know me. The boy grinned. Yeah, but I figure if you wanted to sit alone, you'd have told me to leave already. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't sure what to say. No one had ever invited themselves into his space before. I'm Zane, by the way, the boy continued, reaching for his juice box. Just moved here last week. Caleb, he replied hesitantly. Nice to meet you, Caleb. Zane took another bite of his pizza, then gestured at Caleb's plate. Dude, are you seriously eating just an apple and crackers? Where's the rest of your lunch? Caleb tensed. He hadn't been hungry this morning. His stomach had been too knotted with anxiety to eat breakfast. And Greg didn't always let him take food from the fridge. I wasn't that hungry, he muttered. Zane frowned but didn't push. Instead, he ripped off half his sandwich and slid it across the table. Here. Caleb stared at it. I don't... Just take it, man. I'm not going to finish it anyway. Caleb hesitated before slowly picking it up. He took a small bite, chewing carefully. It was just a sandwich, but for some reason it tasted different. It tasted like kindness. That evening, as the last bell rang, Miss Porter sat at her desk, flipping through her notebook. It was filled with student notes, things she noticed, things she needed to check in on. She turned to a fresh page and started a new entry. Caleb Foster, concerns. Late to school again today. Avoiding eye contact more than usual. Withdrawn behavior increasing. Possibly not eating enough at lunch. She tapped her pen against her chin. Something was wrong. She knew it. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual midday chaos. Laughter, trays clattering, conversations overlapping into a dull roar. Caleb sat at his usual spot in the farthest corner, away from the noise, away from the prying eyes of other students. His tray held little more than an apple and a few crackers, just like the day before. He was used to this. He liked the quiet, or at least he used to. Yo, you're in my spot. Caleb looked up, startled. Zane Torres stood across from him, a tray balanced in one hand and a mischievous grin on his face. You sat here yesterday, Zane continued, sliding onto the bench before Caleb could protest. That makes it officially my spot now. Caleb blinked. That's not how it works. Zane shrugged, biting into his sandwich. It is now. A small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Caleb's lips. He didn't argue. For the next few minutes, they ate in silence. Or at least Caleb ate in silence while Zane rambled about his old school, his terrible math teacher, and the fact that he had already memorized the entire lunch menu. Yeah, so Thursdays are always chicken nuggets, which are decent, but you have to grab them quick before they get cold. And the spaghetti on Mondays. Avoid it at all costs, trust me. It's like eating rubber bands with ketchup. Caleb shook his head. You talk a lot. Zane grinned. I know. You don't talk enough, so I figure we balance each other out. Caleb didn't have a response for that. He just took another bite of his apple. After a while, Zane's gaze flickered down to Caleb's wrist, where the edge of a dark bruise peeked out from under his sleeve. Hey, Zane said, his voice quieter now. What happened? Caleb quickly yanked his sleeve down. Nothing. I just hit it on something. Zane didn't look convinced. Uh-huh, sure. Caleb avoided his eyes, focusing on a crack in the table. He waited for Zane to push, to start asking more questions. But he didn't. Instead, Zane just nodded slowly, chewing thoughtfully. All right. Caleb glanced up in surprise. That's it? Yeah. Zane leaned back, crossing his arms. I mean, you're obviously lying, but I figure if you wanted to talk about it, you would. Caleb didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent so long bracing himself for prying questions, for people trying to fix him, that he didn't know what to do when someone just let him be. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. Later that day, during gym class, they were paired together for a basketball drill. Caleb moved clumsily on the court, clearly uncomfortable, while Zane dribbled the ball effortlessly. You ever played before? Zane asked. Not really, Caleb admitted. Zane tossed him the ball. All right, first lesson, dribble. Just bounce it, don't overthink it. Caleb hesitated before giving it a try. The ball slipped from his grasp, rolling across the gym floor. A few kids nearby snickered. Zane ignored them. Okay, not bad, not bad. Try again. Caleb retrieved the ball and tried once more. This time he managed to bounce it a couple of times before it wobbled away from him. See? Already improving, Zane said. All right now. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing slightly. Caleb followed his gaze and realized that his sleeve had ridden up again, revealing more of the bruise on his wrist. Zane didn't say anything at first. He just stared at it, his jaw tightening. You sure that's from hitting something? He asked, his voice softer than before. Caleb quickly pulled his sleeve down again. Yeah. Zane exhaled through his nose. He didn't believe him, but he didn't press. Instead, he just bounced the ball once and said, I used to be in foster care too, you know. Caleb blinked. What? Zane nodded. Lived with a few different families before I ended up with my aunt. Some were good, some weren't. Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He had never met someone who understood, not really. People at school assumed he was just another kid with a rough past. But Zane knew what it was like. I get it, Zane continued. Sometimes you don't want to talk. Sometimes it's easier to pretend everything's fine, but... He spun the basketball on his finger, glancing at Caleb. You don't have to pretend with me. Caleb swallowed hard. His fingers curled into a fist, his nails digging into his palm. You don't understand, he muttered. Maybe, Zane admitted, but maybe I do. Caleb didn't respond. Zane let the silence stretch for a moment before nudging the ball toward him. Come on, let's finish the drill. Caleb hesitated, then picked up the ball. They didn't talk about it again. But something between them shifted that day. For the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel entirely alone. The house was eerily quiet that evening. Caleb had learned that silence was more dangerous than shouting. Silence meant Greg was simmering, waiting for the right moment to explode. Caleb moved carefully as he cleared the dinner plates, stacking them in the sink with practiced precision. He knew better than to make too much noise. The last time he had dropped a fork too loudly, Greg had grabbed his wrist and squeezed so tightly that a bruise had formed. Tonight he just had to make it through without drawing attention. He reached for a cloth to wipe the counter, but his elbow clipped a small ceramic vase that had been perched near the edge. Time slowed as the vase tipped, wobbled, and then crashed onto the tile floor, shattering into jagged pieces. Caleb's blood ran cold. Greg's chair scraped against the floor in the dining room. What was that? His voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air like a knife. Caleb's heart pounded as he scrambled to pick up the pieces, his hands trembling. Maybe if he cleaned it fast enough, Greg wouldn't. Heavy footsteps approached. Greg loomed in the doorway, his expression darkening when he saw the broken vase. His fingers flexed at his sides, and Caleb instinctively braced himself. You think this house is yours to wreck? Greg's voice was low and dangerous. I'm sorry. Caleb stammered, his throat tight. Greg grabbed his arm, his grip like a vice. You're always sorry, he snarled. His fingers dug into the already tender skin of Caleb's wrist. But sorry doesn't fix this, does it? Caleb winced but refused to cry out. He had learned that making noise only made things worse. Diane appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Greg, she said, her voice quieter than usual. Enough. Greg's jaw clenched, but he didn't let go. Enough? He repeated, his grip tightening. You saw the way that principal was looking at us last time. You think we can afford any more screw-ups? Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears. He kept his gaze down, his breath coming in quick, shallow gulps. Greg finally let go, shoving him backward. Caleb stumbled but caught himself before he fell. Clean this up, Greg snapped before turning on his heel and storming out of the kitchen. Diane lingered for a moment, her arms still crossed. For a split second, Caleb thought, hoped, she might say something. That maybe, just maybe, she would stand up for him. Instead, she exhaled sharply and muttered, You need to be more careful, before following Greg out of the room. Caleb stood there, frozen. The weight of their words pressed down on him like an anchor. He wasn't a child to them. He was a paycheck. That night, Caleb lay in bed staring at the crack of light seeping under his door. He could hear their voices drifting up from the living room. "You're spending too much," Diane was saying, her voice tense. "We barely have enough." Greg scoffed. "Relax. As long as we have the boy, the checks keep coming. What's the problem?" "The problem," Diane hissed, "is that the school is watching us now. That teacher, she's not letting this go." Caleb swallowed hard, curling his fingers into the worn fabric of his blanket. His entire body felt numb. They didn't care about him. They never had. He reached under his mattress and pulled out the only photograph he had left of his real family. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but it was still his most precious possession, his mother's kind eyes, his father's strong, steady hand holding him as a baby. A lump formed in his throat. "I miss you," he whispered. He had spent so long convincing himself that staying silent was the safest choice. But now he wasn't so sure. Caleb sat at his desk staring at the faint bruise on his wrist, his fingers lightly brushing over the tender skin. The pain was manageable. The fear wasn't. Greg and Diane had built a perfect image, a loving, selfless couple providing a home for a foster child in need. And for years, Caleb had played his part, too afraid to disrupt the illusion. But last night, something had changed. Hearing Greg admit that Caleb was nothing more than a paycheck had sparked something inside him, something that refused to stay silent any longer. If he wanted to escape, he needed proof, real, undeniable proof. At school the next day, Caleb found Zane waiting for him in their usual lunch spot in the cafeteria. "Hey," Zane greeted, watching Caleb closely. "Rough night?" Caleb hesitated before nodding. "Greg lost it again," he admitted in a low voice, keeping his gaze on his tray. "Diane tried to stop him, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Zane clenched his fists. "You need to tell Ms. Porter. She already suspects something's up." Caleb let out a bitter laugh. "Telling isn't enough. You saw how Greg handled the last meeting. He's good at lying. If I don't have solid proof, no one will believe me." Zane leaned in. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Caleb took a shaky breath. "I need to record him, the things he says when he thinks no one else is listening. And I need evidence of how they're using the money they get for taking care of me." Zane nodded, his expression serious. "That's smart. But how do you record him without getting caught?" Caleb reached into his backpack and pulled out an old phone, the one Greg had taken from him months ago when he said kids didn't need distractions. Caleb had secretly retrieved it from a junk drawer, and to his relief, it still worked. "The microphone still picks up sound pretty well," Caleb said. "If I hide it in my room, I might be able to catch something." Zane grinned. "Man, this is like a spy mission. You got this." Caleb hoped he was right. That night after dinner, Caleb carefully positioned the phone on a high shelf in his room, partially hidden behind a stack of books. His hands were clammy, his stomach twisting with nerves. He sat at his desk, pretending to work on homework, waiting. It didn't take long. Greg stormed into the room without knocking. "Did I tell you to go to your room?" he snapped. Caleb tensed. "No, sir." "Then why the hell are you in here when there are dishes in the sink?" Greg demanded, his voice sharp as a blade. "I was going to do them." "Going to isn't the same as doing them, boy," Greg growled. "You think you can just slack off and do whatever you want? Not in my house." Caleb forced himself to stay silent, his heart pounding so hard he thought Greg might hear it. Greg sighed in irritation. "You're lucky we even let you stay here. No one else would put up with you." He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Caleb waited until he heard Greg's heavy footsteps fade down the hallway before letting out a shaky breath. He grabbed the phone, stopped the recording, and pressed play. Greg's angry voice filled the tiny room. Proof. The next morning, before heading to school, Caleb stood in front of his mirror, lifting the sleeve of his hoodie. The bruise on his wrist had darkened overnight, the edges a sickly shade of yellow and purple. He grabbed his phone and snapped a picture. It wasn't the first bruise he had photographed. It wouldn't be the last. With Greg's verbal abuse recorded and the bruises documented, Caleb knew he needed one last piece of evidence: the financial records. Greg kept all their paperwork in his home office, a room that Caleb was never allowed to enter. But tonight, he would break that rule. After dinner, when Greg and Diane settled in the living room to watch TV, Caleb made his move. He walked past them, keeping his steps light, his posture casual. "I'm going to bed," he murmured. Greg barely grunted in response. Caleb climbed the stairs, but instead of turning toward his room, he paused at the end of the hallway where Greg's office door stood slightly ajar. His pulse thundered in his ears as he slipped inside. The room was dimly lit, the faint smell of old coffee and Greg's cologne lingering in the air. Papers were scattered across the desk in messy stacks. Caleb quickly rifled through them, searching for anything that could prove how they had been misusing the foster care checks. Then he found it. A folder labeled Finances. His breath caught in his throat as he flipped through the documents. Bank statements, invoices, and receipts. Everything showed that the money meant for his care had been spent on expensive clothes, electronics, and even a recent weekend getaway. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures as quickly as he could, his hands trembling. Then, footsteps. Growing louder. Caleb's breath hitched. Greg was coming. Panic surged through him as he shoved the papers back into the folder and slid under the desk, pressing himself into the shadows just as the door creaked open. Greg muttered under his breath, shuffling toward the desk. He grabbed a pen and lingered for a moment. Caleb's entire body remained rigid, every muscle locked in place. "Please leave. Please leave." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Greg turned and walked out, shutting the door behind him. Caleb waited a full minute before daring to move. His legs were shaky as he crawled out from under the desk, his breath uneven. He slipped out of the office and darted to his room, locking the door behind him. Leaning against it, he exhaled shakily. He had done it. He had the proof. The next morning, Caleb found Zane before school. "I got it," he said, handing over his phone. Zane scrolled through the pictures, his eyes widening. "Dude, this is gold. You need to show this to Ms. Porter." Caleb hesitated. His hands were still shaking from the night before. "What if it's not enough?" Zane placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "It's enough." Caleb took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. It was time to end this. Caleb stood outside Miss Porter's classroom, gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His stomach twisted with nerves. Every part of him wanted to turn around, to pretend everything was fine, to stay silent just a little longer. But then he thought about last night, hiding under Greg's desk, barely breathing as he listened to his foster father mutter to himself. He thought about the bruises on his arm, the sharp words Greg spat at him like poison. No more. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. "Come in," Ms. Porter's voice called. Caleb pushed the door open, stepping inside. Ms. Porter looked up from her desk, surprise flickering across her face. "Caleb? What's wrong?" He hesitated, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I need to show you something." She motioned for him to sit, her expression shifting to one of deep concern. Caleb sat down and placed his phone on the desk between them. His hands shook slightly as he pulled up the photos of his bruises, the financial records, and then, finally, the audio recordings. Ms. Porter's brows knitted together as she scrolled through the images. Then she pressed play. Greg's voice filled the small classroom, sharp, cruel, unmistakable. "You're lucky we even let you stay here. No one else would put up with you. The money keeps coming, so why should I care? We just have to make sure the school keeps believing our little act." Ms. Porter's expression darkened. She listened to every word in silence, her grip on the phone tightening. When the last recording ended, she let out a slow breath, as if she were trying to control her anger. She looked up at Caleb, her voice steady but firm. "Caleb, this is serious, you know that, right?" He nodded. She reached across the desk, resting a reassuring hand over his trembling one. "I'm so proud of you for doing this, for speaking up. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Caleb exhaled shakily, relief washing over him. "So, what happens now?" Miss Porter straightened. "I'm taking this straight to the school counselor. We're going to escalate it to social services today." Caleb's heart pounded. It was happening. No more pretending. No more silence. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. By that afternoon, Caleb was sitting in the school counselor's office. His stomach churned as he sat between Miss Porter and Mrs. Hastings, the school counselor, watching as they compiled everything. His recordings, the photos, the financial documents. The social worker, Mrs. Calloway, sat across from them, flipping through the evidence with a grim expression. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at Caleb. "Caleb, I know this has been scary for you," she said, her voice calm and understanding. "But I want you to know you did the right thing." He nodded, gripping the edge of his chair. "What happens now?" Mrs. Calloway sighed. "We need to do a home visit immediately. But with the proof you've provided, we're already preparing an emergency removal order." Caleb's breath hitched. "You mean I won't have to go back?" She gave him a reassuring smile. "Not if I can help it." He barely had time to process that before a voice spoke from the doorway. "Where's Caleb?" Everyone turned. Greg Mitchell stood in the office doorway. Caleb's heart stopped. Greg's eyes flickered to Ms. Porter and the social worker, then down to the stack of documents on the desk. For a brief moment, a flicker of realization crossed his face. They knew. His charming, well-rehearsed mask slid into place almost instantly. "I heard Caleb was here. I came to pick him up." Mrs. Calloway stood, blocking Caleb's view of him. Her tone was professional but unyielding. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to have a conversation. Please, have a seat." Greg hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, his movements tense. He sat down slowly, his jaw clenching. "What is this about?" he asked, feigning confusion. Mrs. Calloway folded her hands on the desk, keeping her gaze steady. "We have received substantial evidence of neglect and financial fraud. We'll be conducting an emergency home investigation, and Caleb will not be returning home with you." Greg let out a laugh, forced, brittle. "Are you serious? This is ridiculous. Caleb is a troubled kid, always making things up." Ms. Porter spoke up, her voice ice cold. "The bruises? The recordings? The financial fraud? Is he making that up too?" Greg's eyes snapped to her, his mask cracking. His usual cool, calculated demeanor wavered. He glanced at Caleb, his gaze darkening. "You told them?" His voice was low, quiet. Caleb forced himself to sit up straighter. He swallowed past the fear clenching his throat and met Greg's stare head-on. "Yeah," he said, voice shaking but firm. "I did." Greg's hands curled into fists. He looked ready to explode. But then Mrs. Calloway spoke again. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm advising you to cooperate. If you try to interfere, we will have law enforcement involved immediately." Greg's jaw twitched. His gaze flicked between the adults, calculating, weighing his options. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. Finally, he let out a harsh breath, standing abruptly. "This is a mistake," he spat. His voice was tight, controlled rage simmering beneath the surface. "You people don't know what you're doing." Without another word, he turned and stormed out. The moment he was gone, Caleb sagged in his chair, his entire body shaking. His hands trembled so badly that he clenched them into fists just to keep them steady. Ms. Porter placed a hand on his back, her voice gentle. "It's over, Caleb. He can't hurt you anymore." Caleb closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. It was over. That evening, social services arrived at Greg and Diane's house. Caleb wasn't there to see it, but he imagined Greg trying to put on his usual act, charming, respectable, the perfect foster parent. But it wouldn't work this time, because the truth was out. By the time the visit ended, Greg and Diane were formally removed as foster parents. An emergency court hearing was scheduled, and criminal charges against Greg were being prepared. And Caleb? Caleb didn't have to go back. Instead, he sat on the edge of a bed in a temporary foster home, staring out the window, trying to process everything. Ms. Porter had visited him before she left. "I'll see you first thing tomorrow," she had promised. "You're not alone, Caleb. Not anymore." And for the first time in years, he believed her. Caleb sat in the cold wooden chair, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he could barely hear the murmurs of the courtroom around him. The polished mahogany walls, the judge's towering bench, and the solemn atmosphere made everything feel surreal, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And today, he had to face Greg and Diane one last time. Ms. Porter sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. On his other side, Zane gave him a small nod, his expression filled with unwavering support. Across the room, his social worker, Mrs. Calloway, was reviewing the thick stack of evidence they had gathered. And then, at the front of the courtroom, stood Greg and Diane Mitchell. Greg was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair combed neatly, his expression calm and composed. Diane sat beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of a devastated mother. Their lawyer stood in front of them, already beginning his speech. "Your Honor, my clients, Greg and Diane Mitchell, have provided a stable and loving home for Caleb Foster. Raising a foster child with a troubled past is never easy, but they have done their best to support him. The accusations against them are nothing more than a misunderstanding, fueled by a child who has difficulty adjusting to authority and discipline." Caleb clenched his fists. The bruises, the so-called neglect, these claims have been exaggerated. Discipline is necessary for a child's development, and sometimes children lash out against those trying to help them. Caleb's stomach twisted at how effortlessly the lawyer twisted the truth. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "the allegations of financial misconduct are unsubstantiated. My clients have always prioritized Caleb's well-being and have used the funds to ensure he had food, shelter, and proper care. There is no evidence of wrongdoing." No evidence? Caleb felt his breath hitch, but before he could react, Mrs. Calloway stood up. "Your Honor, we have substantial evidence proving otherwise." She placed a thick file onto the judge's desk. "Within this file, you will find photographic evidence of Caleb's injuries, audio recordings of Mr. Mitchell's verbal abuse, and financial statements showing that foster care funds were misused for personal luxuries." The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, nodded and began flipping through the pages. The courtroom was silent, save for the shuffling of paper. Then Mrs. Calloway continued. "Additionally, we have testimony from multiple witnesses, including Caleb's teacher, Ms. Porter, and his friend Zane Torres, both of whom have observed signs of abuse and emotional distress." Greg shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Diane sniffled, playing the part of the wrongfully accused, but Caleb saw her fingers gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "We would like to call our first witness to the stand," Mrs. Calloway said. "Caleb Foster." A lump formed in Caleb's throat as he slowly stood. His legs felt heavy as he made his way to the front of the courtroom, stepping into the witness stand. The judge looked at him, her gaze softer than before. "Take your time, Caleb. Tell us in your own words what life was like with Greg and Diane Mitchell." Caleb swallowed hard. This was it. This was the moment he had been terrified of. But then he glanced at Ms. Porter, at Zane, at the people who had stood by him, believed in him. He took a shaky breath and spoke. They were different when no one was watching. His voice was quiet at first, but the weight behind his words grew stronger with every sentence. They smiled in public, acted like they cared, but at home, it was all about money. He lifted his sleeve, revealing the faint bruise Greg had left on his arm. Greg would get angry over little things. If I made a mistake, if I dropped something, if I didn't do what he wanted, he would grab me, shove me, yell at me. He turned to Diane, and Diane just let it happen. She never stopped him. She just told me to be quiet and behave. Diane let out a choked sob. "Caleb, sweetheart, that's not true." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, remain silent." Caleb clenched his jaw. "I heard them talking about how easy it was to get money for fostering me. They didn't care about me. They just cared about the checks they got every month." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it on the desk. "I recorded them. I have proof." The judge gestured for the bailiff to bring the phone to her. A few moments later, the courtroom was filled with Greg's own voice. "The money keeps coming, so why should I care? No one's going to believe some foster kid over us. We're the perfect family, remember? He better keep his mouth shut or I'll make sure he regrets it." The audio ended. Silence. Greg's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. Diane, pale and shaking, looked down, refusing to meet Caleb's gaze. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Caleb. You may step down." Caleb exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and returned to his seat. Ms. Porter squeezed his hand gently. "You did amazing." Next, Zane took the stand. He described the bruises he had seen, the way Caleb acted at school and how Greg had grabbed him in front of the school, I know what a bad foster home looks like, Zane said, and this was one. Finally, Ms. Porter spoke. She detailed her observations, the late arrivals, Caleb's withdrawn behavior, and the times she had tried to reach out. A child shouldn't have to be afraid in their own home, she said. Caleb deserves better. When the testimonies ended, the judge folded her hands. I have heard enough. Greg and Diane sat rigid, their polished performance falling apart. The judge looked directly at them. Greg and Diane Mitchell, the evidence presented today proves clear patterns of neglect, financial fraud, and emotional abuse. Your actions have caused significant harm to a child who depended on you for care and safety. She paused, then delivered her verdict. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your rights as foster parents. Furthermore, Mr. Mitchell, you are under arrest for financial fraud and child neglect. The bailiffs approached. No, you can't do this, Greg shouted as they pulled him to his feet. This is a mistake, Diane cried, shaking her head. Caleb, tell them we took care of you. Caleb didn't say a word. He just watched as the people who had hurt him were finally held accountable. As Greg was led away in handcuffs and Diane collapsed into her chair, sobbing, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. It was over. Finally, truly, over. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he was free. The weight of the courtroom still clung to Caleb as he walked through the school hallways the next day. The verdict had been delivered. Greg was in handcuffs and Diane had lost all rights to foster children. He should have felt victorious, relieved, maybe even happy. But instead he felt empty. For so long he had been focused on escaping the nightmare of his foster home, but now that it was over, what came next? Would he be sent to another foster home? Would he have to start over? Again? The thought made his stomach twist. That afternoon, Caleb sat in Ms. Porter's classroom staring at the wooden desk in front of him. The other students had already left, and the soft hum of the school's heating system filled the silence. Ms. Porter sat across from him, her expression gentle but serious. Caleb, your caseworker has started the process of finding you a new home. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. He had expected that, but hearing it out loud made his chest tighten. Another home, another set of strangers, another place where he'd never quite belong. Do you know where? He asked quietly. Ms. Porter hesitated. Then she took a deep breath as if steadying herself. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. Caleb frowned, confused. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. I've been thinking a lot about this, Caleb. About you. About everything you've been through. He watched her carefully, not sure where this was going. I know you've had to fight for yourself for so long, and I don't think you should have to do that alone anymore. His heart skipped a beat. She smiled softly. What I mean is, I'd like to foster you. Caleb froze. He blinked, certain he had misheard her. You… what? His voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Porter's smile grew, but there was a nervousness in her eyes, like she was worried about his reaction. I want you to come live with me. If you want to, of course. His chest tightened. Was this real? Was she serious? He had spent his entire life waiting for someone to want him, waiting for someone to see him. And now, someone had. But was it too good to be true? You really mean it? He asked, his voice shaking slightly. Ms. Porter nodded. I wouldn't say it if I didn't. She hesitated, then added, I know it's a big decision, and I don't expect you to answer right away. But I want you to know. If you want a home, a real one, I would be honored to give that to you. Caleb stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He thought of Greg and Diane, of all the times they made him feel small, like he was nothing more than a burden. He thought of all the nights he lay awake wishing for a family that actually cared. And now, here she was, a chance at something different, something better, something real. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself hope. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, his throat tightening. And then finally he nodded. I think I'd like that, he whispered. Miss Porter exhaled, relief washing over her face. Then let's make it happen. The day Caleb moved in with Ms. Porter, he stood in front of the house, his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. The house was small, but warm, with a cozy front porch and a garden along the edge of the yard. It was nothing like Greg and Diane's pristine show-home facade. This place felt lived in, comfortable, safe. He swallowed hard, nerves creeping up his spine. Was this real? Could this actually be home? The door swung open and a girl, about Caleb's age, grinned at him from the doorway. "Hey, you must be Caleb," she said, her voice bright and excited. Caleb nodded hesitantly. She extended a hand. "I'm Emma. Mom's been talking about you nonstop." "Oh, and she made cookies. Chocolate chip. Her specialty. You're gonna love them." Before Caleb could say anything, a tall man with sandy brown hair appeared behind her, drying his hands with a dish towel. "Welcome, Caleb." He smiled warmly. "I'm Jack, Emma's dad. We're really glad you're here." Caleb stood there, still clutching his backpack strap, trying to process what was happening. He wasn't being forced to smile. He wasn't being told to stay quiet. There was no pressure to be perfect, just warmth. And people who actually wanted him there. Ms. Porter, his new foster mom, stepped beside him, her voice soft. "Come on, let's show you your room." The room was small but cozy, with light green walls, a soft bed covered in a patchwork quilt, and a desk by the window. But what caught Caleb off guard was the small framed photo sitting on the desk. It was his school picture. He picked it up, staring at it in disbelief. How did you get this?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Porter smiled from the doorway. "I wanted it to feel like your space." He swallowed hard, emotions thick in his throat. No one had ever done something like that for him before. Emma leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed with a teasing smirk. "Just so you know, Dad is way too competitive at board games. But I'm the reigning champion." From the hallway, Jack's voice called, "She cheats! Don't trust her!" Caleb laughed. An actual real laugh. "I don't even know how to play board games," he admitted. Emma shrugged. "No worries. We'll teach you." Ms. Porter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Take your time settling in, Caleb. This is your home now." That night, Caleb lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Not the kind of silence that made his stomach twist in fear, but the kind that felt peaceful. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to sleep with one eye open. He pulled the photo of his biological family from his bag and placed it on the nightstand beside the new framed photo of himself. Two families, one from his past, one from his future, and for the first time, he wasn't alone. He turned onto his side, pulling the blankets tighter around him. A small, cautious smile crept onto his lips. Maybe this is what it feels like to be safe. Maybe this is what it feels like to have a family. The end. Did this story touch your heart? If you believe every child deserves a safe and loving home, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories.